Picture this. You spend 20 years becoming the most famous archaeologist alive. Your discovery rewrites textbooks. Universities invite you to lecture. National Geographic features your work. Then, in your final months, you realize your greatest triumph might be humanity's greatest warning. That was Klaus Schmidt's reality in 2014. Schmidt had uncovered Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, massive stone temples that predated Stonehenge by 6,000 years. The media called it the world's first cathedral. Historians hailed it as proof that organized religion sparked civilization itself. But Schmidt knew something the headlines missed. Hidden in his field notes were measurements, soil samples, and artifact catalogs that told a very different story. Not about humanity's triumphant rise, but about our capacity for spectacular failure. 3 weeks before his death, Schmidt called his research partner at 2 a.m. His voice was shaking. "We got the story backwards," he said. "Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning. It's a gravestone." Every archaeologist knows that deeper layers mean older history. At most sites, you dig down through time like reading a book in reverse. Modern debris on top. Ancient foundations at the bottom. Göbekli Tepe followed this rule perfectly, except for one thing that made no sense. The deepest layer, Layer 3, contained the most sophisticated architecture Schmidt had ever seen from the Neolithic period. Perfectly circular arrangements of 16-ton limestone pillars. Mathematical precision in their placement. Artistic skill that wouldn't look out of place in a Renaissance cathedral. But as Schmidt dug upward through time, the craftsmanship got worse. Layer 2 showed smaller pillars, cruder carvings, less ambitious layouts. Layer Y was practically primitive by comparison. The newest constructions looked like someone was trying to recreate ancient glory, but had forgotten how. This violated everything archaeologists expected. Civilizations are supposed to get more sophisticated over time, not less. Schmidt realized he wasn't looking at a site that had been built and improved over centuries. He was looking at a site that had been built once, brilliantly, then repeatedly attempted by people who couldn't match the original. It was like finding the ruins of a space program, then discovering that later generations could barely build bicycles. When the radiocarbon results arrived in 2003, they confirmed Schmidt's worst fears. Layer 3, the most advanced construction, dated to 9,600 BCE, but Layer 2 came from 8,800 BCE, and Layer 1 was built around 8,000 BCE. The dates revealed something unprecedented in archaeology, a civilization that was most advanced at its beginning, then steadily declined for over 1,000 years before vanishing entirely. Schmidt cross-referenced his dates with climate data from ice cores and lake sediments across the region. What he found made his hands tremble as he wrote his field reports. The decline of Göbekli Tepe perfectly matched the 8.2 kiloyear event, a sudden global cooling that devastated agriculture across the Middle East. But the correlation was more sinister than Schmidt initially realized. The builders of Layer 3 had somehow known this catastrophe was coming. Schmidt's most disturbing discovery wasn't architectural. It was iconographic. The earliest pillars at Göbekli Tepe weren't decorated with random animals. They told a coherent story, carved in stone for people who couldn't yet write. Vultures dominated the imagery. But these weren't ordinary scavenger birds. Analysis of the carvings showed vultures carrying human heads, vultures descending from cosmic symbols, vultures surrounded by scorpions and snakes. A researcher from Edinburgh University later connected these symbols to astronomical events. The vultures represented the constellation Cygnus. The scorpions mapped to Scorpius. The whole complex was a stone calendar, tracking the precession of the equinoxes across millennia. But why build a calendar that tracked such enormous spans of time? Schmidt found his answer in Layer 2. The later carvings showed the same constellations, but now they were associated with flood symbols, falling objects, and scenes of destruction. The builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't just tracking time. They were tracking cosmic cycles that brought catastrophe to Earth. They knew the pattern. Approximately every 11,000 years, the planet experienced massive climate shifts, and they'd calculated that another one was approaching. Schmidt's final breakthrough came from analyzing tool assemblages found in sealed chambers beneath Layer 3. Hidden in the bedrock were caches containing thousands of specialized tools: obsidian blades for precision cutting, grinding stones calibrated to specific plant seeds, bone needles designed for particular textile weaving techniques. These weren't everyday tools. They were survival kits. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had deliberately preserved the knowledge and equipment that small groups would need to rebuild civilization after the coming catastrophe. But there was something else in those chambers that changed Schmidt's understanding of the entire site. Seeds. Thousands of domesticated grain seeds, sealed in stone containers with remarkable preservation techniques. Genetic analysis later confirmed these were selectively bred variants, the result of centuries of agricultural development. The builders of Göbekli Tepe hadn't just discovered agriculture. They had perfected it, then hidden their achievements underground before the climate disaster struck. Göbekli Tepe wasn't humanity's first temple. It was humanity's first doomsday vault. When the 8.2 kiloyear event finally hit around 6,200 BCE, it lasted 160 years. Ice core data shows that global temperatures dropped by up to 3 degrees Celsius almost overnight. Agricultural societies across the Middle East collapsed. The sophisticated trade networks that had supplied Göbekli Tepe with obsidian from distant volcanoes disappeared. The surplus labor that had built the great temples was needed for basic survival. Schmidt tracked what happened next by following pottery styles across dozens of sites in the region. The results painted a picture of complete social breakdown. Advanced ceramic techniques vanished. Multi-room architecture simplified to single-room huts. Artistic traditions disappeared entirely. Even basic innovations like fired clay seemed to be forgotten and later rediscovered. The survivors were scattered into small nomadic groups, each carrying fragments of ancient knowledge but lacking the population and resources to maintain complex civilization. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried during this period, not by enemies or natural disaster, but by the survivors themselves. Schmidt found evidence of careful, systematic burial, using techniques that would preserve the site for future discovery. They were leaving a message for whoever might rebuild. This is how far we fell, and how far you can fall too. In his final interviews, Schmidt obsessively compared ancient climate data to contemporary climate science. The parallels disturbed him. The 8.2 kiloyear event was triggered by sudden ice sheet collapse that disrupted ocean currents. Modern climate models show similar vulnerabilities in the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. The Neolithic collapse happened when agricultural societies had become dependent on stable weather patterns across multiple regions. Today's global food system shows the same vulnerabilities, magnified across continents. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had about 400 years of warning before their climate catastrophe. Current climate projections suggest that we have less than 100. But Schmidt's greatest fear wasn't environmental, it was psychological. The survivors of the 8.2 kiloyear event had forgotten their own history within just a few generations. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge carved into Göbekli Tepe was completely lost. Later, cultures found the buried temples, and thought they were natural hills. Schmidt worried that modern civilization shows the same dangerous confidence that the Neolithic builders must have felt. We assume our achievements are permanent, our knowledge is secure, and our technologies make us immune to the forces that destroyed earlier societies. 3 days before his fatal heart attack, Schmidt completed his last field report. It was never published, but colleagues preserved his handwritten notes. Göbekli Tepe proves that human civilization has collapsed before, completely. The most advanced society of its time was reduced to scattered nomads who forgot their own achievements within living memory. We think we're different because we have computers and satellites and global communication, but the Neolithic builders probably thought they were permanent too. They had trade networks spanning thousands of miles, architectural techniques we still struggle to replicate, and astronomical knowledge that required centuries to accumulate. None of it survived. Not because they were primitive, but because complexity makes civilizations fragile. The more sophisticated our systems become, the more catastrophic their failure. Göbekli Tepe isn't just about the past. It's a warning about our future. We're not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We're just the first that might be foolish enough to ignore the lessons carved in stone by our predecessors. Schmidt died believing that history was about to repeat itself, and that unlike the builders of Göbekli Tepe, we weren't preparing for the collapse that was coming. His final words, according to the colleague who found him, "They tried to warn us. We just weren't listening." Schmidt's death in 2014 should have been a moment for the archaeological community to confront his most disturbing findings. Instead, it became an opportunity to bury them. Within 6 months of his funeral, funding for excavations at related sites mysteriously dried up. Research papers that referenced Schmidt's climate correlation theories were quietly rejected by major journals. Graduate students working on similar projects found their thesis advisors suddenly unavailable. An Oxford University researcher later described the atmosphere. There was an unspoken understanding that certain aspects of Schmidt's work were off-limits. Not wrong necessarily, just inconvenient. Why would the scientific establishment suppress evidence about ancient climate catastrophe? The answer lies in timing. Schmidt's final conclusions emerged just as climate scientists were struggling to communicate the urgency of modern climate change without causing mass panic. The last thing they needed was proof that advanced civilizations had completely collapsed from similar pressures in the past. Government funding agencies were equally uncomfortable. Military strategists had spent decades planning for gradual climate impacts, rising sea levels, shifting agricultural zones, resource conflicts. They weren't prepared for evidence suggesting that complex societies could fragment entirely within a few generations. So, Schmidt's most radical theories were quietly shelved. Official reports focused on Göbekli Tepe's religious significance, while downplaying its prophetic warnings about cyclical collapse. Schmidt's research partner later revealed that Schmidt had discovered far more than was ever published. Hidden in Schmidt's private files were detailed surveys of 17 other sites across Anatolia, all showing the same pattern. Sophisticated early construction, followed by steady decline and eventual abandonment around 6000 BCE. The sites formed a network spanning over 300 kilometers. Radiochemical analysis of their building stones showed coordinated quarrying operations. Pottery styles indicated regular communication between settlements. Genetic analysis of preserved seeds revealed standardized agricultural techniques. This wasn't just one remarkable site. It was evidence of the first true civilization, a network of interconnected communities that had achieved technological and social sophistication rivaling much later empires. And it had all vanished completely. His research partner described Schmidt's growing obsession with this hidden network. Klaus would stare at his maps for hours, tracing connections between sites. He'd calculated that this civilization had supported a population of over 200,000 people. Where did they all go? The answer came from an unexpected source: ancient DNA. In 2018, 4 years after Schmidt's death, geneticists published studies of Neolithic populations across Anatolia. What they found confirmed Schmidt's worst fears. Around 6000 BCE, there was a massive population bottleneck. Genetic diversity plummeted. Entire lineages disappeared from the archaeological record. The sophisticated network society had collapsed so completely that 90% of its genetic legacy was lost. But the survivors carried something else in their DNA: genetic markers associated with extreme stress responses and enhanced memory formation. Evolution had favored individuals who could remember the traumatic events and pass survival knowledge to their children. The builders of Göbekli Tepe hadn't just predicted their collapse, they had evolved to survive it. Schmidt's most controversial discovery was hidden in plain sight on the pillars themselves. Working with a mathematician from MIT, Schmidt had decoded a numerical system embedded in the arrangements of animal carvings. The positions of scorpions, birds, and mammals weren't random decorations. They were astronomical coordinates, tracking celestial cycles. But these weren't ordinary astronomical observations. The system predicted the exact timing of the Younger Dryas climate event that occurred 12,900 years ago. It calculated the duration of the 8.2 kiloyear cooling period. Most disturbing of all, it projected future climate disruptions based on recurring cosmic cycles. According to these calculations, Earth experiences major climate catastrophes approximately every 11,000 years, triggered by predictable changes in solar radiation and cosmic ray exposure. The next cycle, according to the Göbekli Tepe calculations, was due to begin around 2030 CE. Schmidt had initially dismissed this as coincidence. Ancient peoples couldn't possibly have possessed the astronomical knowledge required for such calculations. But as he cross-referenced the predictions with modern climate data, the accuracy became undeniable. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had somehow discovered the same cosmic cycles that modern scientists were just beginning to understand. The mathematician later published their findings in a limited circulation physics journal. The mathematical sophistication required for these calculations exceeds anything we've seen from pre-literate societies. Either we've drastically underestimated ancient capabilities, or this knowledge was inherited from an even earlier civilization. Schmidt believed the latter. In his private notes, he speculated that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were themselves survivors of an earlier collapse, one that had occurred during the Younger Dryas event 12,900 years ago. This would explain the paradox of Layer 3. The first construction was most sophisticated because it was built by people trying to preserve knowledge from an even more advanced predecessor civilization. Göbekli Tepe wasn't humanity's first great achievement. It was humanity's second attempt at greatness, built by survivors who remembered the first attempt's failure. The digital Göbekli Tepe. In his final months, Schmidt became obsessed with a disturbing parallel between ancient and modern information systems. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had carved their most crucial knowledge into stone, a medium that could survive millennia. But they had also created a distributed network of human memory keepers who could preserve and transmit complex information without any physical storage medium. Modern civilization, Schmidt realized, had made the opposite choice. We store vast amounts of information in digital systems that are incredibly sophisticated but also incredibly fragile. A solar storm, electromagnetic pulse, or simple infrastructure failure could wipe out libraries' worth of knowledge instantly. Worse, we've become completely dependent on these systems. Most people today couldn't survive without GPS navigation, digital banking, or computerized supply chains. We've created a global civilization that's more complex than anything in history and more vulnerable to sudden failure. Schmidt calculated that modern society could collapse more completely than the Neolithic civilization because we lack the backup systems that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had deliberately created. We have no human memory keepers, no stone libraries, no distributed survival caches. If our digital infrastructure fails, we lose everything at once. In his last interview, Schmidt posed a chilling question. What if Göbekli Tepe was built by the smartest civilization in human history? Not the first, but the wisest. The only one that actually learned from previous collapse and tried to prepare for the next one.